be around the world, and thank you for your company once again on truth2u.org. That's truth, number 2, letter u.org. Joining me is the Director of Education and Counselling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca. That's jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
Shalom, shalom, Jono, and
Shalom.
It's great to be back with you.
Wonderful to have you once again, my friend. Of course, we are continuing our series exploring the book of Psalms, chapter by chapter, and asking questions: who composed the psalm? What is it about? What was happening in the life of the author at the time of the composition? How might it apply to us today? And when applicable, what would Christianity have us believe about this particular psalm, and how does that deviate from the original intent? I don't know that we'll be going there this time round. We are, of course, up to Psalm chapter 13. And before we began this recording, I said to you, I think this is probably going to be our shortest one. And you went,
You never know.
You never know. Well, let me read it, because it is a very short psalm in any case. And it goes like this. To the chief musician, a psalm of David. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemies be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord my God, enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say I have prevailed against him, lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. Michael.
Isn't that beautiful? It's compact and it's punchy, and that's, as we'll see, there's probably a lot there. So, first of all, it's not a mystery who wrote this. This is written by David. Mm-hmm. It's one of David's Psalms, one of his songs. And the first thing that anyone that reads this psalm notices is the repetition, right? The 4-time repetition of the phrase, how long?
How long?
In Hebrew, ad ana, 4 times, ad ana. So, I mean, that's just very blatant. It sticks out. Mm-hmm. And the question is really what's going on there.
And the next thing that comes to mind for me, one of the questions I want to ask you, how does it read in the Hebrew? The very first line, it doesn't seem to, it has a strange, it says, how long will you reject me forever? How long?
Yeah,
and forever.
Well, it's interesting, because the phrase could have just said, and it would have read perfectly well, how long will you forget me, God? Yeah. Because that's what it sounds like he's asking. And by having this additional word of netzach, forever, what he seems to be saying is that, it seems that this is just dragging on forever. He seems to be, almost looking forward to an endless time of this. Sort of a very pessimistic kind of a view, meaning that it sounds like someone who isn't just consumed with what they're going through at the moment, which we've seen that so many times in the last 12 Psalms, that David is constantly, writing about the torments that he's experiencing in life. But we have come to understand that, in general, the Psalms are specifically focusing on some event, some circumstance in his life. Right. And so you would expect him to be legitimately, let's say, for example, if this is a psalm that is dealing with his being pursued by enemies and feeling, rejected and abandoned by God, so it's something that's happening right now, but he's almost making it worse by giving the impression that, he feels this is just going to go on endlessly. How long is this going to last, God?
Now, you said he feels, so this is perhaps the way that he writes this, it's an expression of his feeling of abandonment and despair. So the forever there is to reflect the way that he feels rather than a projection of time.
Yeah, I think it's expressing tremendous frustration, because it's one thing to be going through a difficult period in your life, but if you know it's going to end, the classical example is the woman in labor. I mean, she's going through tremendous travail and pain, but she knows it's going to come to an end. And many things in life, a person's studying for finals, or they have some kind of a medical issue they're dealing with, and they know they're going to come out of the hospital one day, or they get into a spat on Facebook. they know that one day they're going to block the person. I mean, most things. We suffer through it, but here, I mean, it's an expression of Netzach means eternity, and he's saying right off the bat here, this almost it's sort of coming out of him, this painful groan of God, is this going to go on forever? So we don't normally.
Well, we don't. Therefore, one would think, okay, so then this is very significant. This is a significant event in David's life. Then the next question we ask is, well, what event? What is this? Do the sages pinpoint a particular event?
Not really. I mean, almost all the Psalms that we've been reading are generally tied to his, difficulties with his father-in-law, with King Saul. And then there are other, there's no lack of other episodes where he's got difficulties from various quarters. But no one really, I haven't seen anyone really pinpointing the source of this frustration.
Okay.
And, the truth is that what most of the sages maintain is that even though David expresses this psalm, this meditation here of suffering in the first person, as if he's going through it, just about all of the sages and all the commentaries say it's really, this is it's Israel personified, that this is really going beyond David's personal life, and it's speaking about Israel, the people of Israel in general, and their suffering over the tremendous suffering over the long course of their history. And so there, the word eternal comes really sharply into focus, because it certainly does feel like that, as being part of the Jewish people. We have a long history, it goes back over 3,000 years, and it hasn't ended. It's 3,000 years later, and look what's going on. People are being blown up in the streets of Israel, and we have every few months at the United Nations, it's the whole world voting against us, and we're being boycotted, and Iran is threatening to wipe us out with nuclear bombs, and it's been 3,000 years basically of persecution, of suffering, of hatred, of feeling isolated, feeling abandoned. And, and we'll see in a minute why they say this. I'll get to it in a minute. But that's generally what happens. They pivot away from David's personal experience, and they say that really he's speaking here, you could even say prophetically, but he's speaking here of the experience of Israel in their long, long history and exile. And the Midrash here, the rabbinic Midrash, which goes back, hundreds and hundreds of years, plays off of these four words where Israel here, I mean, it's David saying, ad ana, how long? It can also be understood, I should point out, it doesn't only have to mean how long, it could mean to what end. I mean, what is the purpose of this? Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, it's interesting that what's going on here, let's say we swing it back to David for a minute, that it's not necessarily David asking this directly to God. It sounds like that. It sounds like God is being addressed directly, and David's complaining to him and saying, what's going on here? How long is my suffering going to last? How long do I have to put up with this? But another way of looking at this is, to what end shall this be going on? What's the purpose of this suffering? And really, what I think it's very possible to read it this way is that it's really an inner dialogue that David is having with himself, meaning that he's, as a believer, he's sort of wondering to himself, I'm sure, that as someone who really has an intimate relationship with God, he's always wondering. He's not necessarily throwing this at God. He's wondering inside, why am I going through this? Why am I experiencing this? What is the purpose of this? And we see in verse 3 where he speaks about, I'm putting thoughts into my own soul. I'm contemplating this. How long do I have to, How long do I have to keep on turning these thoughts in my own soul? How long do I have to seek counsel within myself? It's hard to translate those words in verse 3, but he's almost alluding to the fact there that this is an inner struggle he's going through with. He's pondering and he's bothered.
It's interesting because putting it that way, it reminds me, if you were perhaps to summarize the first 5 verses, there is a verse I think that we've already addressed, and I can't remember which chapter, where David says, "Will my soul praise you from? Will I praise you from the grave? What is the purpose if I die?"
Exactly. And I think that you could obviously say that both things are going on here. That he's really posing this to God, and yet I'm sure that these are thoughts that he often wondered about as a sensitive person, as a religious, as a spiritual person. These must have been thoughts that consumed him, and also the impulse of the spiritual person is to often wonder, why am I going through this? Because maybe I deserve it. And the person will often try to seek the cause of his suffering in the hopes of maybe addressing those causes, meaning that if the suffering is a result of some transgression or some falling short, the religious impulse is not to blame others. That was the great fault of Saul, his father-in-law, was to blame others, was to deflect responsibility. And we know that David, immediately accepts responsibility. He doesn't wait for 3 seconds before he totally accepts, when Nathan, the prophet, confronts him, and says, "You're the man," David immediately repents and he expresses remorse.
Says,
and he doesn't.
I've sinned, yeah.
Yeah.
Another example just comes to mind, Michael, of the story of Shimei. When Shimei is attacking David and David doesn't give the order to have him killed, he says, "Who knows? Maybe this is warranted. Maybe I deserve this. Just let him go."
Exactly. So I think that when you read these verses in the beginning here, it sounds like a complaint against God. It sounds like expressing frustration to God, which on some level it is. On the other hand, I think that he's also churning inside and wondering, why am I going through this, and to what end is it? What's the purpose of all this suffering? It's interesting, by the way, in the very second line, he speaks about, how long will you hide or conceal your face from me? Just an interesting point about the Hebrew words here. This is referred to in Hebrew as hester panim. Hester means hidden or concealing, and panim is the face. And really what the face does is the face of everyone reveals what's going on inside. They say, for example, in Hebrew, that panim, the face, reflects the pinim, the inside. The word pinim means inside. And so if you want to see what's going on, with someone, you don't look at their elbow, you don't look at their stomach, you look at their face.
As they say, the eyes are the window to the soul, right?
Exactly. The face, right? Not just the eyes, but the mouth and so the facial expression, it reveals what's going on inside, and it's really the way God would be revealing himself. I mean, is speaking anthropomorphically here. When it speaks about God concealing his face, what it's really saying is, David is saying, God, I don't know what's going on with you anymore, because your face is being concealed from me. It just could have said in Hebrew, you're concealing yourself. But the use of the word face is significant because the face is specifically that part of the body that reveals what's going on inside. And so he says here, and I'll get back to the midrash I just spoke about a few minutes ago, there are these 4 expressions here of how long will you forget me, how long will you hide your face, how long will I put ideas into my soul, and how long will my enemy triumph over me. So the Midrash has something very, very poignant here. And the Midrash says that what's really going on here is that God is basically, they give you the context of this psalm, and they give you the background, and they say that God says to the people of Israel, look, you're the ones that threw me out. You exiled me. God basically accuses Israel of pushing him away. And the Midrash cites 4 times where God uses the expression ad ana, how long. Right? God is the first one to say it. And here are the 4 expressions. God says in Numbers 14, verse 11, how long will they provoke me? This is at the incident of the spies when, here God had sent 10 plagues to redeem them from Egypt, and he split the sea for them, and he spoke to them at Mount Sinai, and he's been feeding them with manna from heaven and providing them with water from the rock, and he's leading them with a pillar of fire and a cloud, and they're being surrounded by miracles, daily miracles. And then they come to the border of Israel, which is where they're supposed to be going, and they send spies to check out the land, and the spies come back and they say, it's a beautiful place, it's gorgeous, but the people are really strong there. And the whole nation, they begin crying, and they give up, and God gets exhausted with them at this point. I mean, God's put up with a lot already. They're complaining throughout the journey in the desert. We don't like the food, and there's the water that tastes bitter, and there's no water, and they were complaining. But this finally, it's almost it's the last straw, because God is basically saying, don't you get it? I mean, I've taken you so far. Don't you think I can bring you into the land? Is it so hard for me? So in Numbers 14:11, God says, how long will they provoke me? This is after the spies come back with a negative report. And then in the same verse, he says, how long will they not have faith in me? And then later in the chapter, in chapter 14, verse 27 of Numbers, how long for this evil assembly that provokes complaints against me? So those are 3 times where God says, ad ana, how long? And then the 4th example they have is not ad ana, but it's a similar expression, ad matai, Numbers 14:27, that God says, ad matai, how long for this evil assembly, which is it's synonymous with ad ana. But the 4th example is in Exodus 16:28, where God is sending the manna down from heaven and tells them that they're not to collect anything on the Sabbath, that on the 6th day they'll get a double portion, but not to go out on the Sabbath. And we know that some of the people go out on the Sabbath. Yeah. Right? And God says in chapter 16, verse 28 of Exodus, how long will you refuse to observe my commandments? So he gets frustrated 4 times. And so what the Midrash says is that because of these 4 times that the Jews provoked God, and God had to say, how long? How long will you provoke me? How long will you disobey me? How long will you refuse to believe in me? Right? When God has to say this because they've exiled God. They've thrown God out, and they've lost contact with God. So God says in the Midrash, because of this, I'm going to have to exile you 4 times. And we know from the book of Daniel in chapters 2 and 7, our reference to these 4 kingdoms, these 4 empires. In chapter 2, the king has a vision that he asks Daniel to interpret. And you have a similar vision in the 7th chapter of Daniel. And it's not really spelled out exactly in Daniel who these refer to, these kingdoms, but the sages say that these refer to the 4 exiles of Babylon, of Persia, of Greece, and of Edom, which is called Rome, or the present exile that we're in now. And so the Midrash says that because you threw me out, you exiled me, God says, and you provoked me to, in exasperation, have to exclaim, how long will you, how long will you, how long will you, how long will you? I'm going to send you into these 4 exiles. which again covers the whole scope of Jewish history. And because you're going to be in these 4 exiles, you will be prompted, right? You as the people will be prompted for you to scream out, ad ana, right? That you will, as in this psalm, this is the psalm where the people now respond to their long exile by saying, how long will you forget us? How long will you hide your face? How long will my enemy triumph over me? So you have the psalm basically expressing, according to this view, not just the life of David, but the history of the Jewish people, where their long history of exile really is a response to they turning away from God. Their exile really prompts them to, as we see in this psalm, cry out to God or cry out to themselves, how long is this exile going to go on? Isn't it long enough already? How long do we have to put up with this suffering? How long will we be, tormented by our enemies? And then what the Midrash says to conclude, and we'll jump to the last verse just for a minute, but then we'll get back to it later. But the Midrash says that the last verse in the psalm actually expresses 4 languages of salvation. That they first say, Va'ani b'chasdecha batachti, that I trust in your loving kindness. And then they say, Yagel libi b'shuatecha, that my heart rejoices in your salvation. And then it says, Ashira l'Adonai, I will sing to the Lord. And then finally, Ki gamal alai, because he has dealt bountifully with me. So at the end, there are 4 expressions, if you will, of salvation. So that's how the Midrash sees this psalm, that it's basically really a historical presentation of the sinning of the Jewish people, their rejection of God's presence in their midst, God in exasperation sending them into their long exile, their response to the suffering by calling out to God. We'll see praying to God ultimately, because this is a prayer, this is a psalm, and then finally experiencing God's salvation. So that's at least one way in which this psalm is approached, meaning that it's both approached as dealing with the life of David, and it certainly could be read that way, but also as dealing with the more general expression of the history of the nation of Israel and their experience of exile.
Just coming back to what you were just saying regarding the final verses, it is difficult to reconcile the way it opens with the way it ends, though, don't you think? Because, at least in this translation, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face? How long shall I take counsel? So on and so forth. And then at the end, but I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. How can he say, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me, when he also begins by saying, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?
That's actually the beautiful mystery of this psalm. And it's one that all the commentaries, speak about. I think there are a number of ways of addressing that. And, we can skip to that now before we get there, actually. I think there are a few things that I would share, and this applies both to the experience of David as an individual and to the history of the nation. That the truth is that both David and the nation have in the past experienced God's salvations. For example, our national history, the history of the people of Israel, begins with God redeeming them. And so it's that awareness and that consciousness of God's past salvations that allows them to have faith in future salvations. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why the rabbinic tradition is that the Messiah will come Passover time. And they say that just as we were redeemed in the past in the month of Nisan, Passover time, so too will the future redemption be in Passover time. And what's interesting is that if we think about how the Passover Seder is set up, the evening where we commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, the whole Passover Seder experience revolves around a meal. And it revolves around reciting chapters of praise to God, what we call the Hallel, the Psalms of praise to God. Mm-hmm. And these chapters of praise, the Hallel, praising God, is split up into two. Half of it appears before the meal, and half happens after the meal. And all the commentaries point out is that the Seder has two parts to it. The first half of the Passover evening commemorates the redemption from Egypt. Mm-hmm. But the part of the Passover Seder that happens after the meal is looking forward to the future redemption. And that's a very clear difference in the themes between the beginning of the Passover Seder in the evening and the end of the Passover Seder. So that's also happening in this psalm. And if you look at the actual syntax of the last verse, it sort of goes back and forth between past and future tense. For example, the last phrase says, I will sing to the Lord, future, because he has dealt bountifully with me. Mm-hmm. So that's one way of looking at this transition, meaning that even though David and the people are experiencing tremendous suffering and travail and frustration, but they look back to the fact that we have experienced salvation in the past, and that's why we can have faith that we will be redeemed in the future. But I think a more, to me, beautiful way of looking at this, and your question is a very good one, because it is striking that, the psalm begins so negatively and so in such a depressing manner, and then it's sort of like it flips, like it's a very sort of it very quickly flips.
It's almost wonder, by the time you're finished with the chapter, you're like, well, what was all that about?
And you're wondering, like, how did that happen? How did he get pulled out of his doldrums so quickly? Yeah. Within the course of 3 or 4 verses.
It's like, woe is me, as he's scratching out the lottery ticket, and then all of a sudden he gets the numbers and he's like, but it's all good. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, but it's interesting because here he's scratching lottery tickets and it's not coming out, right? It's another one he throws in the garbage and then he gets up and sings and dances. So I think that the most beautiful way of looking at this transition is that the structure of the psalm is one where it begins with his complaints, basically. It begins with the complaints of either David and or the people of Israel. Mm-hmm. And then it goes into a prayer, meaning that after the complaining in the first verses, it transitions in verse 4. He says, look and answer me, O Lord my God, right? It's not just complaining, it's answer me, show yourself, meaning that it begins by talking about God not being there, hiding, and now he's saying, look at me, right? Answer me by looking at me, let me feel you're with me. And so he asks God to lighten my eyes, meaning that my eyes were dimmed because I wasn't seeing anything, meaning that the language here is very evocative because the beginning of the psalm, it's speaking about not seeing because God is in hiding. And here he's asking to be able to see. I want to see you, God. Give me a peek. Let me see something. And he goes on to continue the prayer because if you don't, right, my enemies are going to rejoice over me. And then after the prayer, all of a sudden, in the last verse, David and the people saying this psalm, scream with this incredible trust they have in God's loving kindness. Not just they trust in God's loving kindness, but that we will rejoice in God's salvation. And so I think that, the most poignant way of looking at this is that what flips and what changes is that the experience of prayer itself is what turns their despair into hope.
It then is a reflection of hope. Now, I ask because...
But you see, in the psalm, right, what is being expressed is despair. Mm-hmm. What's being expressed is frustration. And then how does that flip into not just hope, but rejoicing and singing? It's because right after the frustration came a prayer. And what transforms the person, meaning the person that feels despair and feels tormented and feels abandoned, it's by turning to God in prayer and expressing those thoughts that expression of prayer itself, that turning to God in prayer, is what lifts us up. And so we see, for example, in Psalm 34:19, we're told that God is close to the brokenhearted, meaning that when we express our brokenness and we express our despair and we express our sense of alienation, that itself brings God close. That by us expressing our broken hearts, that itself is what brings God close. In Psalm 147, verse 3, we're told that God heals the brokenhearted. So once we express our broken heart and we pray to God, we become healed through the prayer. There's a very beautiful passage in Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15, where God says, I'm with the despondent and the lowly of spirit to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the despondent. So I think what really transitions here, what really is the catalyst for this radical transformation, is that it's the prayer. It's the fact that the person or the people here turn to God in prayer, and that turns their despair into hope.
Considering the confusion in what seems to be confusion in the tense from the opening verses to the last, I have a note in my Jewish study Bible, and it says, in regards to the tenses being confusing, it says, and a more literal rendering would be, in regards to the final verses, but I trust in your faithfulness. May my heart exult in your deliverance. May I sing to the Lord because he has been good to me. Do you think that's fair?
It's a possible rendering of the Hebrew, but I think that a more literal reading, the tenses are pretty clearly in the past and in the future. Ashira, the very last phrase, Ashira l'Adonai, I will sing to the Lord. Ki gomal alai, because he has dealt bountifully with me. Even the first phrase, Vani b'chasdecha batachti, and I will trust in your loving kindness. Yagel libi, my heart will rejoice in your salvation. So again, the JPS there is a possible way of rendering the Hebrew, but I think that it's equally fair, if I would say even more literal, more faithful to the language here, to really see that there's both a past and a future expressed in the same verse. Now, there's something interesting that goes on in this psalm that contrasts it with Psalm 10, with chapter 10.
Oh, okay.
And what's really, because you'll see, if you take chapter 10, I think it's verse, what verse is it? Verse 11. So chapter 10, verse 11, you have a very similar phrase that's used in this psalm as well. It's the combination of God not remembering or God forgetting and God.
Now this is the evil person. This is the wicked man who says in his heart, God has forgotten. He hides his face. He will never see.
Exactly, right. And those two expressions of that God hides his face and God.
In fact, all three of them, surely. God has forgotten.
Forgets.
That he hides his face and that he will never see. I think I see where you're going, because he says, you will forget me. Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face? And he pleads with God to consider and hear me. Okay. So,
it's interesting that these terms are used by the wicked person in Psalm 10, but they're used by David here in Psalm 13. And really what you see is two different ways of understanding Hester Panim, the hiding of God's face, because
it's a comforting thought to the wicked. The wicked comfort themselves
exactly.
with going, he hides his face. Don't worry about it. Whereas here, David is almost in torment over it.
But the real difference is that for the wicked person, the wicked person thinks that God hiding his face means that God is not involved, that God basically has checked out, that God is no longer
and that justice won't be served upon them.
Exactly, meaning that since God is out of the picture, I can do whatever I want. And David understands that even though God is hiding his face, he still sees us. He's still aware. And how do we know that? Because David speaks to him. So, the righteous person understands that even in a situation where there is the hiding of God's face, it doesn't mean that God isn't there. But God is aware, and God sees what's going on. And what happens here is that David really appeals to God and says, look, I understand, in effect, David says, that, when you hide your face from us, you have a reason for doing it. You either want to correct us, or you want us to, to turn inward and be introspective about our relationship. God, you certainly have your reasons for hiding your face. But what David is saying here, apparently, is that, for whatever reasons you have, it may cause more harm than good. Meaning that at the end of the day, the wicked people will take your hiding of the face, and they're going to cause, really, a diminishment of your name. And it's interesting because it's very similar to the arguments that Moses uses several times with God. God, several times gets fed up with the Jewish people, for example, after the golden calf. And God, wants to essentially do away with the people. And Moses says in Exodus 32:12, what will Egypt say if you destroy Israel? Meaning that, God, you're going to look impotent. You're going to look like, you just don't have any power. You'll look powerless. Meaning that, you sure have your reasons for being upset, God. I know that you're upset, but, you're going to lose in the end. He sort of throws this to God and says, you're going to look bad. And then after the incident of the spies, when God also wants to wipe them out, Moses says in Numbers 14:15, what are the nations going to say that you couldn't bring them into the land? So the same argument is really being made here, that God, if you keep on ignoring us and turning your back from us and forgetting us and abandoning us to our fate among the people that are trying to hurt us, you're going to look bad, because these evil people are going to rejoice. The enemies are going to say, I prevailed against him. And it's interesting that, we know that when it says that I have prevailed against him, it's not just I prevailed against David. When I prevail against David, I prevail against David's God. And so, the enemy is really saying two things here. I've beaten David, and I've beaten David's God as well. Because we know that, the people of Israel are God's representatives, where Isaiah chapter 43 says we're God's witnesses in this world. And so...
doesn't that remind you of the boasts of Goliath?
Exactly. Exactly. I had one more question to ask about this psalm, which is troubling, by the way.
Yeah.
If we look at this psalm as, let's say the expressions of King David, he's speaking as someone that has a tremendous amount of faith in God. He's speaking as someone who clearly recognizes his relationship with God, and he recognizes that, it's interesting that he basically says to God in the beginning of this chapter, what I want, God, is your attention. I want you to pay attention to me. Yep. I'd rather that you punish me than just ignore me. I want to have your involvement in my life. And so what's interesting is that here you see the speech, the expressions of a person who's clearly a righteous person. And so if he really is that righteous, and he's able to express his total confidence and trust in God, even when he's suffering, so why is a righteous person like this suffering so much? Meaning that, who are the people that should be getting clobbered like he's describing in the beginning of this psalm. So it is a bit of a conundrum. If David is recognizing this and he's expressing such total faith in God, he's clearly not someone who's evil and wicked. And so why is God doing all this to him? This goes back to the previous weeks where we discussed the whole question of why the righteous suffer in this world. And again, one of the themes I believe it's a theme that emerges from the Tanakh, is this theme of noblesse oblige, that people who are on a higher spiritual level, more is expected of them.
Required more, yeah, that's right, yeah. And that seems to bear out every time, and certainly Moses is a strong example of that, not being able to go into the land.
Exactly, and I think David as well. I mean, David is such a person that has, the heart of someone who is totally with God, and yet he's someone that suffers immensely in his life. And, so although you could say that, there were some serious mistakes that David did make in his life, and he himself feels that a lot of his suffering was punishment for his, serious indiscretions. So it's a question that really, I think, does emerge from a lot of these Psalms where, if David is the speaker and David is the writer, and he is a righteous person, he's no one else wrote the book of Psalms. I mean, here someone that was able to compose the Psalms is not a wicked person, is not a spiritually inferior person. He's on a very high level. And so we have to, think about why he does experience so much suffering and travail.
That opens so much that we could talk about that obviously for a long, long time, and we don't have time to do that. And it does remind me, as I mentioned before, of the reason why Moses wasn't allowed to go into the land for what we would generally see as maybe an almost trivial reason, something that he did really doesn't seem like it was that bad, but because of the position that he was in, because of what he was entrusted with, he was held to a much higher account. Oy.
Yes.
Are we done with chapter 13?
Well, for tonight.
For tonight, we're done with chapter 13.
When we go finish the whole book of Psalms and we come back for the second round, we'll go deeper.
That's what we'll do. But that, of course, brings us to 14, which we have alluded to quite a number of times so far in these first 13 chapters. We're finally going to get there. And when it comes to, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, what would Christianity have us believe about each psalm, and how does it deviate from the original of 10? All the fireworks go off when we get to Psalm chapter 14. I'm looking forward to doing that with you very soon, my friend. Rabbi Michael Skobac of JewsForJudaism.ca is the website, JewsForJudaism.ca. That's Jews for Judaism in Canada. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Truth to You with me, Jono Vandor. Join me on the coming Truth to You Israel tour. Details at our website, truth2you.org. That's truth2u.org. Thank you for your company, and I hope you'll join us again. Until next time, Shalom.